introduce to you our special guest, Joel. Give it up for Joel. Joel, we have a microphone for you over there. Liliana, can you grab that mic for him? Maybe he can grab it faster. I don't know. It's over there. It's the black one, the one on the right. Yep. There you go. Just hold that button for a second. It'll turn on. Green light.
All right.
There you are.
There we go. Well, I'm going to just start off with a quick prayer. Lord, tonight I just ask that you would, Lord, as you spoke the world into being, your words carry power, and I just ask that you would speak through the words that come out of my mouth. Give me a grace to be able to hold the thoughts together and to be able to share you accurately and well. In Jesus' name. So, I have ADHD. My thoughts are all over the place. I spent about 6 hours yesterday just thinking about things that I could cut out. But I was thinking on sharing from Joseph and Samson, both young men who were called from a very early age. Samson, much like Jesus, his mother was met by an angel and told, "You're going to have a son." In the case of Samson, his mom was pretty old. She was barren, which means she had not had any children. And so there was he was called as a Nazirite even from birth. His mom started living the Nazirite vow even before she became pregnant. And that was a pretty big deal. Like, there's only a couple of other people that may have lived the Nazirite vow for a good portion of their life. Would have been John the Baptist and Samuel. It's a little fuzzy. The Nazirite vow is often something that people would do, for a month or two at a time, or for a season. Kind of like a fasting and praying, a way of drawing closer to God. Samson pretty much lived it his whole life. Joseph, at about the age of 17 or so, maybe a little earlier, had some dreams. He was one of 12 sons, and the least liked among the brothers because their dad was very emotionally unstable in some ways. Like, as you read through the story of Joseph's father and that whole family, there's just all kinds of emotional ups and downs and family infighting and everything. And so Joseph's dad was playing favorites. And Joseph was the favorite one, which meant he was on the outs with certainly his 10 older brothers. He had a younger brother that was also pretty favored by their dad. They have very different experiences throughout their life, but they both had a lot of troubles. And as I was thinking about troubles, one of the things that I was reflecting on is what do we need to get through the hard times? What do we need to get through trouble? And it's a purpose, it's a meaning to it. Like, if what we're experiencing is meaningless and empty, it doesn't matter how good it is, it's almost impossible for us to get through it. We just give up. It's like, I don't feel like it. Why would I get out of bed this morning? But if we have a meaning and a purpose that we are looking to achieve, then the troubles, they don't become irrelevant, but they become manageable. Like, it's something that we can see our way through. So if we're looking for meaning and purpose, where do we start for meaning and purpose? That actually starts back in Genesis, early on in the creation process. well, I shouldn't say real early on. It was day 6 as we look at creation. God created Adam and Eve. And one of the first things that God says to Adam is, and God blessed them and said to them, this is Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And also, behold, I'm giving you every plant that yields seed on the face of the earth, and every tree that bears seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. From the very beginning, God is saying, I'm giving you a responsibility to be in charge of the earth, to be in charge of what I have just created. At least as far as the birds of the air. The heavens and all of our exploration, all of our attempts to see beyond Earth. I'm kind of neutral on that. It's like, that sounds like a whole lot of effort to go somewhere that, it's not that we aren't welcome, it's just not our primary responsibility. We could maybe do better here at home before we start trying to make it all the way to Mars or somewhere else. Although it's really cool, I like the science that gets us there. But then the next thing, or how it starts off with Adam is they're placed in the Garden of Eden. And even before Eve is created, God brings all the animals to be named and everything. Adam is starting to step into that role of, being in charge of all the earth. Adam's the one that named the animals. It wasn't God that gave them their names. Who came up with the word zebra? Well, about 600 languages later, because of sin in the Tower of Babel and a whole bunch of stuff, we ended up with the word zebra. But Adam was the one that gave original name. So that was part of knowing the earth, being in charge of it, and ruling over it. So that's all purpose that we as humans have. We have a responsibility before God to take care of the world around us. But even now, thousands of years later, from Adam and however many generations it's been, the earth is full of people. So we also have a responsibility to take care of each other. And each one of us, that purpose looks different, whether it's working as a scientist in biology, working as just even a bus driver, taking care of other people on their way to work or kids to school, or, a doctor or a nurse, or a mom taking care of children, a father, working a second job that he doesn't particularly love because it's what his family needs to be provided for. All of that is a way of taking care of each other. And sometimes that needs to be balanced, like the dad working a second job. Well, okay, sometimes, yes, for this period of time, I need to do this, I need to provide this, certain set of goals that family needs. But then there's other times like, no, I can't work that job this summer. This summer I need to be around, I need to be home with my kids and taking them to the park, or, whatever the circumstances of our lives dictate. It looks different for each one of us, like how we live our lives before God. One of the things from the New Testament, I didn't look this up a whole lot because it's primarily from the Old Testament tonight. But Paul writes about working out our salvation with fear and trembling before God. Pretty sure that was Paul that said that. But essentially, yeah, as our life circumstances, we each have different experiences. How we live it is to be lived out before God. Like, we're accountable to Him for doing our best. One of the so that meaning and purpose for each of us has to be deeply rooted in who we are, and it essentially becomes a part of our identity. As I get older, I look back at all the opportunities that I had. Some that I took, some that I didn't. There's some that I would love to think that, man, if I took this opportunity, my life would be so much better. Reality is probably not. Probably be a whole lot worse. But we have no way of knowing. Because one of the things that I want to encourage you with is, even if we make a wrong decision along the way, God is still working through us. He's going to fulfill His call. And there is a point where we can just turn away. We can say, nope, I'm not doing it. I'm not even trying. I'm sitting down and not going to. God, I don't care what my purpose and the point of my life is. I'm just not trying. He is a respecter of us, and He's not going to push us. But I'm speaking tonight from the perspective of, I have this basic assumption that each one of you wants to live a fulfilling life, and that you have either a relationship with God or at least enough knowledge about God and who He is that you're interested in a relationship. Even if you're not there at that point of saying, yes, Lord, I have decided that I want this personal relationship with you, that you're at least interested in it. You're thinking about it. You're considering it. So that's my basic starting point for tonight. And if that's not the spot that you're at, any one of us leaders would love to be able to talk to you about it more if you're interested in hearing, or what's that mean to have a relationship with God? Who's this Jesus guy and how do we relate? And He seems far off and distant. How's that work? We'd love to be able to talk with you, but that's not kind of. I'm assuming for what I'm saying that we're kind of past that spot. So there's many different ways that the world deals with troubles, with problems. Here's some phrases that came off the top of my head. Some of them are parts of songs, some are just phrases. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. This one's a song, I think, when going through hell, just keep going. God doesn't give you more than you can handle, or God will always provide a way out, is a common one. And I always, in my head, whenever God's providing a way out, boy, that's one I struggle with, because that's just, it's almost got enough information to be true, and it's not. We'll get to that later. Here's kind of an old one. Suck it up, buttercup. Just kind of hold it together. Why are you? Yeah, don't give up. One of the things that I'm seeing coming out in culture today that was not anything that I had on my experience growing up is kind of a victim mentality of, if you've been harmed, you're the victim. A victim can't have accountability or be held responsible for the harm that was done, so they don't have any accountability. I haven't lived your experience, so your experience is your truth, so I can't talk to you about changing or making that bad thing better because it didn't happen to me. So I have to allow you to think, act, and feel in whatever way you want, no matter what the consequences are for me, because I haven't lived your experience. And that really is not, all of those are really not what God has to say about what it means to live a fulfilling life, even in the face of troubles. I'm gonna, here, this is the one. Go to Ezekiel 18. So Ezekiel 18 is a pretty rough chapter. God is not real happy in telling Israel exactly where they are wrong. Israel kind of had this feeling, and it's something that I'm beginning to see reflected in the culture of the people very much felt like, I'm going to take everything I can get now. It doesn't matter what the consequences are for later. And the parents were essentially selling out their children, creating worse trouble down the road, and thinking that it was okay. So Ezekiel 18:19. Yet you say, why should not the son suffer for the sins of the father, when the son has done what is just and right, and has been careful to observe all my statutes, he shall surely live. It's the soul who sins that will die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. But if a wicked person turns away from all of his sins that he has committed, and keeps all of my statutes, and does what is just and right, he shall surely live. He shall not die. None of the transgressions he has committed shall ever be remembered against him. For the righteousness that he does shall live on. Have I any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord? And not rather that he should turn from his ways and live? But when a righteous person turns away from his righteousness and does injustice and does the same abominations that the wicked person does, shall he live? None of his righteous deeds, none that he has done, shall be remembered. The treachery for which he is guilty and the sin that he has committed, for them he shall die. And it goes on for several verses where God's saying, and yet you say, this is not just. Essentially, even here from the Old Testament, this is a couple of hundred years, maybe about 1,000 years even before Jesus came. That's the salvation message laid out right there. God's saying, listen, each one is accountable for your own actions, for your own decisions, your own choices. And we're going to see that kind of played out through Joseph and Samson. Even though some of our troubles can be caused by, in Joseph's case, it was his father's and even his grandfather's and his uncle's power struggles within the family, and it's all messed up. Some of you, I'm sure, come from families where there's parts of the family you never speak to or never see, or they're, just constantly at strife with other factions of your family, with other people in your family. That was very much the case there for Joseph, for his father and uncle and grandfathers. He was not a part of that per se, but he was still paying. A lot of his troubles were rooted back in the actions and the decisions of others. And yet, what this is saying here in Ezekiel is that our salvation is not dependent on that. One of the first commandment, I'm the Lord your God. You should have no other gods before me. I'm a jealous God. And goes on to say that the Lord will, or for 3 to 4 generations of those that do not love the Lord the sins will pass from generation to generation. But for those that love the Lord, the blessings of the Lord will pass for 1,000 generations. This is off my notes, but it just popped in my head, so sorry, I don't have the exact references. But one of the things about that is we see that in Joseph's life. Grandfather, father, and to Joseph, for 3 generations, 4 generations, there is this power struggle and family dynamics because of the parts of each person's heart that they were not fully giving to God, that they were not following God to the best of their ability in that way. They weren't willing to give it up to God, and it created these dynamics that went from generation to generation. It's not just that God's saying, I'm an angry God and I'm going to make everybody pay for every sin ever done. It's more of it's just a life reality. If your parents are having struggles, you're going to share in them as their child. And so when there's ungodly things happening in a family, that can go from generation to generation. But it's not so much God saying every generation has to pay for the previous one. Here in Ezekiel, what he's saying is, no, it's the one that sins that will die for their sins, or it's the one that is righteous that will receive the rewards of righteousness, even in the midst of those struggles from generation to generation. And honestly, that 1,000-generation blessing, we are all living under that 1,000-generation blessing. It doesn't matter if you are the first person to hear the name of Jesus in your remembered family history. If we go 1,000 generations back, there was somebody that was listening to and following God with all of their heart. There is that 1,000-generation blessing is a blessing that, we all have that. All right, so I'm going to jump forward here to Samson. I'd introduced him a little bit earlier. So at the time of Samson, Israel didn't have a king. They'd been sinning against God, and so God allowed neighboring nations to beat them militarily. They were paying taxes to the neighboring kingdoms and basically being enslaved for 40 years. And so the angel of the Lord came to his mother, and then to his mother and father together, and said that, hey, he's going to live as an Nazarite. So never cut his hair. And for his mom, even during pregnancy and stuff, she did not eat grapes or drink anything that was fermented. So back in the day, that's even like anything made with vinegars and that sort of stuff. Like basically anything that could ferment, he was supposed to avoid. And through that, that was just a way of that he was supposed to symbolize above and beyond a normal relationship with God for that time, that I'm dedicated to God. That being said, Samson didn't necessarily get that message. He was keeping the bare minimums and he was playing on the edges. He was constantly kind of walking over here and, this is what God said I can do, but that's kind of fun out there. He was kind of always on that edge, not being respectful towards God and what God had called him to do. And so God's purpose for him is to be judge over Israel and bring freedom to Israel from the nations around them that they've been subject to. gets a little complicated because Samson's causing a lot of his own troubles throughout his life. He goes over to the neighboring kingdoms, the ones that Israel's subject to, and sees a beautiful woman and says to his parents, hey, I want to marry her. Tells his dad, I want to marry her, go arrange this marriage for me. She's the one I want. God uses it. It's not what God would have wanted, though. And even Samson's dad or father's like, isn't there anyone here? And this is a basic principle even today for us. Bible talks about not being unequally yoked. It's one thing if you get married and then you meet Christ, you dedicate your life to Christ later, and the Bible's very clear that it's okay for a Christian to be married to a non-Christian. Like, this isn't a salvation thing one way or the other, and that a Christian being married to a non-Christian brings salvation to the family. Like, it's an end to that family to bring Christ into the family and to. But if you have the opportunity, like as you're making decisions now at a young age about dating and as you get older and enter into relationships, it's very clear that it's best if you date and marry another Christian so that you have a combined value system that you can work together effectively within the marriage. And so his dad pushed back against this a little bit. He's like, isn't there anybody from Israel? Nope, this is what needs to happen. And it opens up this whole thing where now Samson's leading Israel. He's supposed to be judging Israel. That helps. That means like he's deciding cases between the Israelites that are having troubles. And in Israel at this time, the legal and the spiritual systems kind of were pretty well enmeshed. So some of it's spiritually related issues. Some of it's just two neighbors hate each other and they're fighting over the property lines. All this sort of stuff can come before Samson to judge. And yet he's leaving the nation and running around looking like he's not fully committed even to the people and the culture that he's leading. He ends up killing 1,000 men at one point with a jawbone of a donkey, because he wants to marry this lady, and his dad says, I don't think so, but he's like, no, this has got to happen. So his dad arranges the marriage. They go down, and the people there at the wedding make a bet with him for like 30 pieces, 30 coats. And if they can answer his riddle, they'll give him 30 coats. If they can't answer his riddle, they will give him 30 coats. If they can answer the riddle, he has to give them 30 coats. And so they basically start bullying. They can't answer it, and they start bullying his wife during the wedding ceremony because it lasts for a couple of days, and bullying her. And finally, she's crying at the wedding saying, if you really loved me, you would tell me why haven't you told me the answer? And then turns around and tells the answer to the people that he made the bet with. So he has to pay him 30 coats because they gave him the correct answer. So he goes out and he kills 30 people, takes their coats and gives them to the people he made the bet with. Well, that upsets them, obviously. So they come up to Israel, back to his home, and are like telling everybody in the community, because remember, at this point, they're still controlled by the other nations. They come up and say, hey, you got to give us Samson, or we're going to kill you all. And so Samson then tells the guys around, okay, I will go with you if you won't kill me yourself. And so they're like, yes, we promise we won't kill you yourself or ourselves. And so they take him down to the Philistines, and as they get there, the Spirit of God comes on him. He picks up a jawbone of a donkey. It says, and with it, he struck down 1,000 men. God used this whole scenario, like God's whole call and purpose to Samson was to free Israel from the Philistines. And even in the midst of Samson making bad choices and flirting on the edge of just kind of where he was walking in God's presence, and just because God is working through us for the greater good doesn't mean that we're walking completely right with God. Like each one of us carries something in our hearts. It's our sin nature that we carry through, and it's with us everywhere we go, and we can create our own troubles out of that. Samson's so that marriage doesn't really work out. So later on, Samson goes back. He's looking for another woman to marry, and he finds a lady named Delilah. And there again, he's making his own trouble. He's playing, kind of mental, emotional games with her, and finally, and he's not using wisdom. Like, he's not doing anything to protect himself. He's expecting the Spirit of God to lead him out of all of his troubles. And finally, Delilah's like, What is the secret to your strength? How is it that God gives you this much power? And finally he tells her, well, it's because my hair has never been cut. And at this point, he'd flirted on the edge of what God had called him to do so much that And when Delilah saw that he had told her all of his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines and said, come up again. He has told me all of his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her, bringing the money in their hands. And she made him to sleep at her knees. And then she called a man, and he shaved off the locks of Samson's head. And his strength left him. And then she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he woke up from his sleep and said, I will go out as all the other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Like, he was so used to disregarding the Spirit of the Lord when he didn't want to be following God's ways, that he didn't even notice when God left him. He woke up, went, well, I'm just going to go do the things that I always did, and he went out, and he was captured. They put him in prison, they gouged out his eyes, he's now blind, and his days are spent literally pushing the grindstone, grinding their grain, because he didn't even have, he created his own troubles. He didn't carry God or his relationship to God with enough respect to protect that in any way. And at the end of his life, he's brought out to be a spectacle. They're having a big feast and worshiping the pagan gods, Dagon specifically. And so they brought Samson out to perform feats of strength and basically to mock him. And Samson said to the young men who held him by the hand, remember he's blind, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. And now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there was about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called on the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and strengthen me only this once. O God, that I may avenge the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and then he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed with all of his strength, and pulling upon the pillars, the house fell down upon all the lords and the people who were in it. And so whom he killed in death was more than he had killed in all of his life. So he killed like 3,000 people here. And he's still fulfilling the purpose that God had put on his life to bring military and like political freedom for the nation of Israel. He ends up killing all of the leadership of the nation that was enslaving them and bringing them freedom, but at the cost of his own life, because he hadn't sought, or he hadn't used wisdom. He'd created his own troubles, and it ended up costing him dearly. His very life, and a lack of satisfaction and a constant fighting. And God would have still used him to bring Israel freedom, and would have done it miraculously in a different way, and much more miraculously, probably, if Samson had just been willing to listen to God, to be respectful of that relationship, and remember his right place. Like even at the very end there, he was like, Lord, do this for my eyes. They took my eyes from me. He was, so even as we struggle, I guess part of this is, one hand, we can create our own trouble. We need to be careful. But on the other hand, don't think that God is just giving up on us because we screwed up, because we messed up. Samson was doing it the whole way through his life, and it cost him dearly. So that there is, and I think part of the reason that Samson struggled with this is he didn't really take to heart the purpose that God had given him, the purpose that God had called him to. His parents had received that purpose. They had lived out everything that God asked them. They had raised Samson to know God's call for his life, and they had done everything they could. But just like Ezekiel says, the righteousness of the parents didn't automatically pass on to Samson. And Samson ended up paying for his own sins with his life. Another way that, or Moses is another one. He didn't get to enter the promised land. He led Israel out of Egypt and through the wilderness for 40 years. But because he didn't obey God correctly, and it was the second time that he made water come from a rock. The first time God said, hit it with a stick. The second time, I think he was supposed to speak, but he was angry, and so he hit it with a stick. God still made water come from the rock. But then he took Moses aside and he's like, dude, you're angry with the people, and you're taking out your anger and not acting correctly before the people. Like, God was saying, I'm not angry with the people. You were angry with the people, and so you allowed your anger to be a reflection on me. And so God didn't take away his leadership or anything like that, but he's like, you don't get to lead them into the land. And so Moses led them right up to the border, to the river, and Joshua led them into the land then. Joseph, on the other hand, was one that, despite the fact that his father was playing favorites and there was all this family turmoil in the background, he had an understanding of who God was in his life. And he was keeping his perspective on who he was and who God is. He was keeping that balanced pretty well. he had some. I mean, when he was 17, he had these two dreams. Both of them pretty clearly showing that at some point his father and brothers were going to bow down and honor him. And as a 17-year-old, he shared that probably a little bit more widely than he should have. You know, it pissed off his brothers. It's like, oh yeah, well, hey, I had this dream, and you know, God's telling me things. And it ended up kind of costing him in that his brothers already didn't like him because he was the favorite. And then he tells them these dreams. And even his father's, who he's favorites to, is rebuking him and saying, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept these sayings in mind. Kind of like Mary, with all the angels and the prophecies and everything coming with the birth of Jesus. It says Mary pondered these things in her heart. Even then, Joseph's father is kind of like, okay, he's speaking out of line, but at the same time, boy, what's God saying in the midst of this? And so a little while later, after the dreams that Joseph's bragging about, his father sends him off to meet up with his brothers, and as they were out leading some sheep, and they see him coming, so they throw him in a pit. Start second guessing it, like, okay, we don't want to be responsible for killing him. We're pissed at him, but we don't want to be responsible for his death. So they pull him back out and sell him to some traders who were going past as a slave, and he ends up going down to Egypt. His brothers go back there. They're playing into this whole family dynamic, the sins, to the third and fourth generation cycle. They're lying to their father. They take his coat, they rip it up, they kill an animal or kill a sheep, and dip his coat in the blood, have it all ripped up, and say, oh, sorry, we found this. He must have been killed by a wild animal, to explain why Joseph just disappeared. And Joseph is now in Egypt. It's truly not his fault that he's there, but he's dealing with troubles. He's a slave to the head jailer for Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's the king of Egypt. The guy that buys him as a slave is the jailer that oversees the king's prison. And you got a question? Statement? What's that? The chief executioner, yes. And Joseph, though, in the midst of this, he understands that God is God and I am not, but I'm going to follow God with all of my heart. And so he's faithful with everything that Potiphar gives him to do. And pretty soon, Joseph's running Potiphar's whole house. The Bible says that the only thing that Potiphar had to worry about is choosing what food he wanted to eat each day. Joseph ran everything else. Potiphar's wife, though, sees that Joseph's, this is kind of a good guy, and she's interested in him and keeps trying to seduce him, keeps trying, making herself available. And, man, I'm interested in you. And Joseph, because he recognizes that God is God, I am not, but I'm going to honor God, is telling Potiphar's wife, no, that's dishonorable for me before God. And it gets to the point where the one day he literally has to run out of the house, leaving his coat behind. She's hanging on to him, and leaves his coat in her hands as he flees. He's doing the right thing. He's doing the honorable thing. He's living correctly. And she she's upset with him and comes back, or when her husband Potiphar comes home, she says, "Look at this slave you brought into our house. He tried to attack me. It wasn't until I screamed that the other, servants came and he was trying to take advantage of me." Potiphar puts Joseph in prison. Now he's in prison. He went from slave to prisoner. He's locked up. But he still recognizes God is God. I am not. But I'm going to be faithful to God. So even in the midst of prison, before long, all right. So he was put into the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to succeed. So even in the midst of troubles, from hated brother to slave to wrongly accused and imprisoned, God's still there with him. He's suffering massively, a lot of troubles that are not of his responsibility. But because of his faithfulness through that, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the long and the short of the story is Pharaoh's upset, throws the chief cupbearer and the baker into prison. They're there for a while, kind of half forgotten, and they both have dreams. Joseph interprets their dreams. The one was returned to his position of authority. The other was executed. And it was the cupbearer that went back to the king and to his old job, just saying, "Hey, when you get to the king, tell him about me. I'm all of the stuff's happened. I'm in jail wrongly. If you can get me out, please talk to the king." The guy completely forgets about him for 2 more years. But then Pharaoh has a dream, and nobody can tell him what it means. And suddenly this cupbearer is like, "Oh, this Joseph guy helped me out." And goes back to the king. He's like, "Hey, king, so 2 years ago, yeah, sorry, I kind of forgot to say something to you, or I was too terrified in the moment because I just got my job back and didn't want to bother you too much. But I didn't say anything. There's this guy I met in prison. He interpreted a dream for me, and it was right." Joseph's brought before the king. Bible even says he had to shave and everything, to make himself presentable. But he's brought before the king. He interprets the king's dream, giving honor to God, because the king says, "What is the meaning of this dream?" And Joseph's like, "I don't know. I'm not the keeper of dreams. God is the giver of dreams. The interpretation is God's. But I know God." He's keeping that position of God is God and I am not. He's keeping that perspective correct. And God is able to use each one of us most effectively when we keep that perspective correct. And are faithful to the things that we have in front of us. Even if we don't see how they relate to a greater purpose or a greater call. That's an overarching theme to our life that God has given us. Being faithful in the moment, every place that we are. God just builds upon that throughout each of our lives. It actually ends up coming back, Joseph's dreams come true. Pharaoh says, "Hey, who better to be in charge of," one of the whole dream thing was, "Hey, there's a famine coming in 7 years. You got to save up grain for 7 years so that you can survive the 7 years of famine, because it's going to be so bad, nobody's going to remember what a good life was by the time this thing's over. You know, if you want to just survive, we need to save up this thing. So Pharaoh says, hey, who better to carry out the preparations for this famine than the guy who could interpret the dreams, and puts Joseph in charge of the whole country. So Joseph is working directly under Pharaoh and saves grain. They make huge stockpiles, and when the famine hits, they're ready to go. Joseph's family hears about it, and they're like, hey, so Egypt has a lot of grain. We're almost dead up here. We're starving. So his brothers come to Egypt. Joseph meets them, sends them back. There's this whole dynamic of Joseph has learned to be faithful in the responsibility that he has at the moment. He's learned from sharing his dream before that, you know, maybe he's learning wisdom as he's getting older. So he kind of feels his brothers out, tests them a little bit, see where they're at. You know, how should I reveal myself? But in the end, he reveals himself to his brothers. He forgives them. They don't trust his forgiveness. Like, they really don't. They think, you know, here's the second most powerful guy in the kingdom. He's going to kill us. And they think that a couple of times. First, when he reveals himself. Second, years later, after they've brought their father and Benjamin, the younger brother, and everybody to Egypt, and the whole family is living in Egypt where Joseph can provide for them. His dream of his father and brothers bowing down before him came true, because they came in. They have to bow down before in Pharaoh's court before Joseph. That dream comes true, but Joseph is able to provide, and God through Joseph provided not just for himself and his family, but for entire nations, the nation of Egypt, and obviously with Joseph's family and others coming around, God's providing for a huge portion of the known world at that time because of Joseph's faithfulness. And that was in the midst of troubles. So I just wanted to, share this because, like I was saying at the beginning, there is big overarching themes of what is our responsibility as people. It goes back to creation. And there is huge debates. I mean, this Bible is big. That's because there is a lot of stuff in here. And it's told as stories. It's God speaking from outside of time and space through people, telling us this story in a way that we can understand, of who he is and who we are and how we can live with him and receive his salvation and fulfill the call that he has given us. And in the midst of that, we can make things harder on ourselves, or in the midst of troubles, it doesn't make the troubles go away, it doesn't make the troubles easier, but it does make the outcomes better as we keep that right perspective of who we are in relationship to God. So, Lord, I just bless each one of us here tonight to be able to keep the perspective correct in our hearts, minds, and spirits of you are God and we are not. But that as we listen to you, as we seek to follow you, especially in the hard times, especially when there's troubles, that we don't have to live in more troubles of our own creation than are already surrounding us, but that we can faithfully follow you in the midst of the troubles that we just encounter throughout life, and trust to your mercy and your grace, and know that you will go through each struggle with us. In Jesus' name, amen.